All right, hello. Welcome back to the 60 Years of Collecting Symposium here on the campus of the University of Massachusetts Amherst. I'm so thrilled to see those of us in the audience, and then welcome to those who are joining us online as well. My name is Sam Redman, and I'm a historian and a professor here in the Department of History. I teach courses on U.S. history, public history, and oral history, but my professional research interest is really all about the history of collecting and exhibiting, and I am thrilled to be moderating this panel with three very incredibly interesting and thoughtful participants. And today we're going to continue the conversation about collecting and thinking about the stories of the materials that can be gathered and brought together and thought of from different perspectives. I'm glad that this room is warmed up a little bit. It felt like I was sort of in the cold section of the grocery store, staying fresh for a long time, but it was a really invigorating conversation this morning, and I'm looking forward to carrying that on. So our format for this conversation will echo the panel this morning, and by that I mean I would like to, in a moment here, turn it over to Nico wheadon and Denise Markonish and Mark D. Mitchell, who will each give us an introductory statement. We've sort of challenged folks to share something about their practice and their work and how it intersects with a lot of the themes of today's symposium. And following that, I would like to ask some questions to the panelists, and then we'll open it up for a broader discussion. I will say the light is right in our eyes, so do come forward if and when you have questions and give us a big wave, and we'd love to have you participate in the conversation. But I don't want to miss anyone from asking a question. So without much more ado, anyway, I'd like to introduce Nico wheadon, who's an independent art consultant, curator, and educator, and writer based in New Haven, Connecticut. And I'd like to invite her did you decide, would you like to take the podium?
I decided to stay here.
Okay, sounds great.
Yeah,
That's
I
great.
kind of moved all my things in to
Okay, perfect. Well, I'm gonna turn it over to you to introduce yourself and your work and sort of get the ball rolling on this conversation.
Cool, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Okay, hey. Audience participation. And can someone just tell me where I point this? Just anywhere?
Oh, yeah, it happened.
Okay. Oh, it's working. Great. Yeah. Oh, okay. There we go. So, hi, I'm Nico wheadon. Thank you so much for having me and for joining us here today. So, I'm not going to assume that you know who I am or what I do, so I'm just going to run through that very quickly as an orientation into how I care about collecting and collecting practices. So right now, currently, I work as a consultant to cultural institutions, namely museums, but also government agencies and artist entrepreneurs, curator of exhibitions and public programs. In fact, if anyone is in the New Britain area tomorrow, stop by the New Britain Museum of American Art, curating a day-long symposium there celebrating 30 Americans exhibition, which is a collection of amazing work that's been traveling around for now something like 20 years. So really working to bring that collection to life tomorrow. I'm an educator, currently critic at Yale School of Art, and I'm a writer. I write about arts and culture in any number of spaces. That's a picture of me and my husband, Malik. Early in the pandemic, we founded an LLC called the Building Fund. And essentially, it's an innovation platform for BIPOC artists, entrepreneurs, and neighbors in our neighborhood. And so working as thought partners to really bring resources together amongst folks that may or may not be in dialogue with each other. So my orientation, this is like a really quick chronology. It's going to leave out a lot, but just roll with me. So I got my start in 2006 at the Studio Museum in Harlem, started as a curatorial intern, moved on to be a curatorial assistant, was drawn to that institution for the dynamism of its mission. I was not a museum person. I might not even still be a museum person, which I don't know if I'm allowed to say that. But yeah, I was just so amazed by like what it meant to really work at this intersection of art and culture and to really think about it as a dynamic nexus. I left there to serve as curatorial director at Rush Arts Gallery, which is another artist-founded institution, also supporting emerging artists of color in New York. And then I did a bunch of things, which included moving to London for a number of years to get a master's degree in creative and cultural entrepreneurship, and then coming right back to the Studio Museum, wearing a different hat, this time to build the public programs and community engagement department, and finding that work at that time to be like very, very important because the museum was announcing, you know, this capital campaign and that it was actually going to close its doors and become a museum without walls. And so being really excited to be in a place that was questioning, you know, museum practices and traditions, like full stop. So I was there for 5 years and then left in 2019 to serve as the inaugural executive director of Next Haven, which is an artist-founded incubator, fellowship program, all sorts of things in New Haven, Connecticut, which is where I'm based now. So yeah, if you would like to tie a little thread through all those experiences, my orientation is, you know, working within artist-founded spaces, but also culturally specific spaces. Those are the communities that I choose to build with. That's where I feel at home. And that's kind of how I orient myself in relation to the conversation we're having today. So, like, what does any of that have to do with collecting? So, as a consultant, you know, I really think about my work as an advocate. So, thinking about what it means to increase representation of Black, Indigenous people of color, women artists, but also to, you know, gently, kindly push institutions towards, like, actually investing in those artists and their practice and their work. As a curator, you know, what it means to activate collections, which we've talked about this today, you know, can be static, can live in storage, can live dusty in places that no one will ever see. So how to really think about programming those collections in a way that bring them into dialogue with community. As an educator, thinking about the professional development of artists and empowering them to meet collectors on their terms. So we've also talked today about power dynamics and, you know, the commercial market, and so really trying to equip artists with vocabulary to really advocate for themselves as needed in these kind of commercial spaces. As a writer, thinking about like, the importance of filling kind of representational gaps, who's missing in the histories that we all are kind of, you know, given in our arts education without question. And so really working to ensure like a broader representation in those art historical narratives. And then most recently as a board member at the National Academy of Design in New York. And so really excited to work with this, like, I say ancient, 200 years is not ancient, but for me it feels old, collecting institution that's also another artist-founded space. So again, kind of anchoring my interest in this artist-driven, artist-centered space. So today I'm going to kind of pull out 3 case studies from Museum Metamorphosis, which is my first book that came out in February of this year. It's a copy, that's the image of the cover of the book on the left side. And in the book, it brings together over 40 cultural innovators, you know, kind of working across the arts and culture ecosystem that are really asking a lot of the questions that we're asking today around sustainability, around relevancy, and around access. Like, what does any of this mean if it's not in conversation with the people who, you know, it says it's for? And so this book was compiled, you know, across 2020, 2021, so we all know, like, the shitstorm of our reality. So all of that is present in the book. It's a roundtable format, and it's people speaking really transparently and candidly about some of the issues that we're facing in our sector. And so this is like my favorite slide. I'll try and leave it up as long as possible, but it's all 43 contributors to the book. I put it here because it really was a community effort. Like, I'm the author that's credited because I guess that's how you do things, but I really feel as though it was a book that was published in community and in thought partnership with these amazing folks, 3 of whom I'm going to quote today. Okay, let me just catch up here. So chapter 6, museum as advocate, and the book kind of plays on this format of museum as fill in the blank, right? So reimagining museums in these kind of roles and responsibilities from everyday life. So thinking about the museum as an entity with agency that can act and move differently than it chooses to do, right? And so chapter 6, how to decolonize museum practices and drive a systemic call to action. And I just wanted to kind of start by uplifting the mission and the work of the Colored Girls Museum, which is based in Philly. And I'm going to read this because I'll botch it if I try and ad-lib. The Colored Girls Museum is a memoir museum founded by Vashti Dubois that honors the stories, experiences, and history of an ordinary colored girls. The first of its kind, the museum initiates the object submitted by the colored girl herself as a representative of an aspect of her story and personal history which she finds meaningful. These objects embody her experience and expression of being a colored girl. TCGM distinguishes itself by exclusively collecting, preserving, honoring, and decoding artifacts pertaining to the experience and her story of colored girls. This museum is equal parts research facility, exhibition space, gathering place, and think tank. And so, there's so much in this mission. I could do a whole talk about this. But just thinking about the questions that it raises, right, which is who dictates cultural value? Who are collections for? To whom do these works belong, right? Thinking about ownership just in terms of actually who produces the objects, but then by holding them, what does that do to ownership? And are the people that own those objects actually present in the space where they're exhibited and discussed? And so I think about this as a kind of radical model for community-led, community-driven acquisitions and collecting. And also really excited by the kind of reparative mode that the museum is working in, thinking that most museums do not do this, right? They do not exhibit works that are dropped off, in the back of wherever, things happen. And so in the book, here we go, Vashti says, my relationship to museums begins with the founding of the Colored Girls Museum, a museum that celebrates the ordinary, extraordinary colored girl through art and artifacts. My understanding of what a museum could and should be to its citizens stems from my belief that it should specifically be an advocate, title of the chapter, a companion, a friend, a reflection of the communities that it seeks to serve. We have these massive cathedrals that call themselves museums. They tell us what's important by what's there and what's not there. And I think that just pulls together, all of the kind of takeaways that I just shared, but, an emphasis on what's not there, right? And really working in that space, thinking about who is often omitted from the narratives of arts institutions. So chapter 8, the Harlem semester, how to adapt art history into contemporary curricular tools. This was a really awesome chapter of life. I was working with Tina Campt, who is a mentor, now works at Brown University, but was then the director of Barnard Center for Research on Women. And she had this radical idea to not teach about Harlem through textbooks, but to actually cite faculty instruction within the cultural institutions being studied, the Studio Museum being one of them, and me working there at the time, and artist Leslie Hewitt teaching the course on the Barnard side and having the classroom literally inside the museum. And so what I love about this is, it really is an embodiment of how the Studio Museum thinks about art history as living history. And so here's a quote from Connie Choi, who's a curator there, working mostly with the permanent collection. And she says, the Studio Museum did not begin with a collection. In fact, the founders of the institution were really adamant about not having a collection because they felt it would weigh them down in terms of having to care for a specific group of objects and not give them the flexibility to be reactive and work with different types of artists. The idea of a collection was born from the artists themselves. They were the ones who gifted works from the beginning of the institution's history because they saw the importance of having their work represented in a mission-specific institution and having those works cared for in the future. I love that. I love that artists were the ones that said, you know what, we trust you to hold these objects and to carry them into the future and to introduce us into a larger mainstream conversation. We want you to be that kind of advocate and that steward. And so, thinking of this as an artist-driven model for, collecting and thinking about acquisitions. Also thinking about, how radical it was in 1969 for the Studio Museum to say, you know what, we don't want to work with the weight of historical like accumulation, right? Like when you acquire objects, you have to hold them and do something with them and present them. We want to be free. We want to liberate ourselves from that traditional model so that we can be a nimble institution that responds to the political climate of the time, right? And like we all know what was happening in '69, like it was a mess, right? And so thinking of that as like a really bold move for an institution to make. And now obviously they have an award-winning collection with like 4,000 some odd objects. But you know, they arove at that sense, you know, through kind of understanding artists' needs. I'm almost done, I swear. Okay, and then last case study. So chapter 9, Find Art Here, how to mold static museum collections into educational access initiatives. Of the things that I've mentioned, this was the one that I touched most closely in my work as then Director of Public Programs and Community Engagement. And I'm actually just going to launch right into reading the quote from my colleague, who's still the Education Director at the Studio Museum, because she really shapes and frames like why this initiative was really important. Find Art Here emerged as we were thinking about ways to deepen the museum's engagement with our neighborhood and working to develop new approaches to providing our Harlem neighbors, oh, hold on, let's all look at the same thing, provide our Harlem neighbors with access to works from the permanent collection. Early on, this started as a conversation between the curatorial, education, and public programs and community engagement departments. My colleagues in curatorial sparked this dialogue by introducing the possibility of being able to produce high-quality reproductions of artworks from the museum's permanent collection. From there, we further developed the idea and vision for what it might look like to foster connections with artists and artworks beyond the museum's walls. We were really interested in exploring how placing artworks in schools, libraries, and other community spaces might shift or enhance people's relationship with the artwork and the artist, and also their sense of ownership of the work. Each site was offered at least a dozen works of art to choose from. We encouraged an inclusive process in which the whole school community, which included, you know, parent-teacher association, faculty, and students themselves, could vote on which work would be installed in their space. It looked different depending on the space and what they needed, and every school ended up getting their top pick. So pictured on the right is Kevin the Kite Man, who's an actual person, by the way. He like sells kites out front of the Studio Museum in Harlem, as kind of rendered in this amazing painting by Jordan Castile. And so, you know, just thinking about like what and kind of educational-led acquisitions, collecting, you know, practices and processes look like, thinking about what that means in terms of youth making decisions about what is worthy of writing into history and how they see themselves in relation to that history. And also just thinking through like community engagement in the sense of like, what does it mean to actually live with a work of art? And you know, that was the thing that in the beginning, folks were scared because they're like, these reproductions are so high quality. What if people think it's the original, you know? Like, what if someone tries to steal it and sell it, you know? And it's like, are we really worried about that? Or are we more worried that people actually have access to these works of art and get to dialogue with them on their own terms in their own space? And so I just end with this picture of Jordan Castile surrounded by, you know, a bunch of students that voted to pick her work. And, you know, as a way to also uplift that she had been working on a relationship with this school like over years, right? It wasn't just that they picked her because they thought Kevin the Kite Man was cool. They picked her because they saw her, you know, however many times a year leading workshops in their school, saw her on the street, saw her in the grocery store. And so really trying to build those connections over time and space. Yeah, and that's my email if you want to email me about anything. Thank you.
That's great. First of all, congratulations on the book, and I look forward to reading it and assigning it in our museums and historic sites classes here on campus. What a great contribution. Thanks for kicking us off. Denise is the chief curator of MASS MoCA, and I think will give us now sort of help build and take us into some new directions as you introduce yourself and your work.
Yeah. Need the clicker. Yep. Hi, everybody. I am, as Sam said, the chief curator at MASS MoCA, where I have been for 15 years, which is like a lifetime in the museum world. It's very interesting, my relationship to collecting. When I think back to the late 90s when I was getting my graduate degree at Bard, which was also right around the time MASS MoCA was opening, I did my master's thesis was all about collecting. It was about artists in particular using their own collections to make their artwork and sort of trace through the history of the Wunderkammer into early department store display to museum display. I come from a family of collectors, so I deeply understand the impulse. And I very rarely worked at a collecting institution. My first job out of grad school was at the Fuller Museum in Brockton, Massachusetts, and they had a collection, and in the 3 years I was there, I acquired not a single thing. Instead, I commissioned artists to do a lot of new work. And when I left there, I went to Art Space in New Haven. We all have New Haven connections up here, which was an artist-run organization where I was the first professional curator they had ever hired. And they also had no collection. So I have this very sort of interesting history related to that. So then 15 years ago, I started working at MASS MoCA, and I always throw this image up because when you're in the buildings, even though you know they're huge, it's always a little hard to understand, but almost all the buildings in that picture are MASS MoCA. And, you know, MASS MoCA was a museum that started off, the very early concept for it was very different than the museum you see today. Let's see, I don't know which version of the PowerPoint this ended up being. Oh, good, it's the right one. I added a few slides at the last minute yesterday. So, you know, the place you know it today is this vibrant contemporary arts something. We always say it's not really a museum, it's something else. This is just a shot of one of our music festivals. We use every square inch of this old historic campus. But the very first idea around MASS MoCA was that it would become a repository. It would be a place for people to house their collections, for artists' estates. You know, seeing in the art world the lack of ability for many collectors or museums to show even a fraction of what they own. And when we opened in '99, that was the first show. It was works from the collection of the Guggenheim and the Panza. We had Robert Rauschenberg's Quarter Mile in our biggest space called Building 5. But then very quickly, our founding director, Joe Thompson, realized that there was something he had to do to honor the history of this site, which had been a manufacturing site since the 1800s, and that we had to get back to making. And so we quickly shifted our mission towards the creation of new work in both visual and performing arts. This is just one, it's not a small example, but it's just one example. A huge part of what we do is we fabricate art for artists. We start from ground zero, and we help them make, as we often say, make dreams come true. So this is an image in progress of Nick Cave's exhibition Until. So there, we're building it in our shop, and then there's a final image of it. This was a show that was co-commissioned with MASS MoCA and also Crystal Bridges and Carriage Works in Sydney, Australia. It also became a site for the commissioning of new performance. For instance, Bill T. Jones, who came out of retirement to perform inside that exhibition. So that's sort of the bread and butter of what we do and what we still do. MASS MoCA has 300,000 square feet of exhibition space. I will just note that we have 3 curators. And about half of that is dedicated to temporary exhibitions. The other thing that's kind of amazing about MASS MoCA is even though we never use what I call the P word, which is permanent, we have a lot of things that are there for a really long time. When I first got there, I was really amazed that they had built up a sort of quote-unquote collection of sound work, and this thing that was essentially ephemeral. You know, MASS MoCA's buildings have no climate control. To get it there or to build any kind of storage to have a collection would have been financially improbable for this startup. So we started commissioning artists to do sound work. So These are two images of spaces where sound works happen, two projects I commissioned. On this side of the screen is Julianne Schwartz, where there's a tunnel that connects two of our buildings. And I asked her to make a piece in there that would use the human voice to feel like it was touching you. And that's been there since 2016. Whenever we do these commissions with artists, we usually start with something like, it'll be here for 5 years to forever. We never put the forever part in writing, but we always we just check in. Does it still feel relevant? Does it still work? We had a piece that was at the quarry in North Adams that the technology finally just failed, and it would have required digging ditches to unearth everything. And we said, you know what? 25 years is a pretty good run for a sound piece in a public park. The other piece is in our boiler house, which is the old building that used to heat the factory, and that has a 20-channel sound piece by Stephen Vitiello in it, sort of really highlighting that industrial architecture. When you climb through that building, which we had to convince our building inspector was a sculpture, not a building, in order to let people inside it. There's no roof, and it's just full of rusted machinery. You encounter this piece, which is Michael Oatman's All Utopias Fell, which is an Airstream trailer turned into a spaceship that looks as if it has crash landed on site at MASS MoCA. This opened in 2009 and is still going strong today. It's a sort of hermitage and really, I mean, Michael is an epic collector. It's a collection of objects that relate to the sun. Another piece that has stayed behind was one that I commissioned as part of an exhibition called O Canada that I did back in 2012, which was a survey of contemporary Canadian art. I ended up doing 400 studio visits across Canada. And I had one artist, Mike Alexier, who said, you know, you've got 63 artists in this show. I want to have the most number of artworks, but take up the least amount of space. So he had this idea to do a piece called A Coin in the Corner. And the French word for corner is coin, C-O-I-N. And so he minted 100 coins with a drawing on them of a coin in a corner. And then we placed them in 100 corners throughout the museum. And then we eventually did a publication so that it could be like a scavenger hunt. But of course, some of them are in non-accessible places, like there is one in my office. And we've just sort of let those be. And I think even with this is very like un-museum-y of me to say, but I work at a very un-museum-y place. I don't even think we have a loan form for this. They're just there. So this brings us to how our mission flipped again. In 2008, we decided that we were going to renovate our first new building since we had opened. And at that point, there were 2 curators, and we, I think, both threatened to run if we got more changing exhibition space. And for years up until this point, our Joe Thompson had been talking with Jock Reynolds, who was then the director of the Yale University Art Gallery. And Saul LeWitt had approached Jock about wanting to have a place to house his wall works. And legend has it that Jock said, we don't have room for that in New Haven, but I know a poor dirt farmer in North Adams who does. And so Jock brought Saul to MASS MoCA, and they wandered around, and Saul picked this building, which is called Building 7, which really sits at the heart of our campus and makes many connection points. And Saul chose that building to have a 25-year-long retrospective of his wall works, ranging from the late 1960s to the most recent one in the show is from 2008, which was after he had already passed away. And this was our first idea of going back to that original concept of housing collections. We sort of refer to it as a museum within a museum. We worked directly with Yale, with Saul LeWitt's estate, with Williams College, and it's a collaborative project of which Saul was the curator, the artist, and the architect. It unfortunately, he passed away right as we broke ground for the renovation. And it's over 3 floors, is 105 drawings. We also use it for pop-up concerts. Dancers love that space. Jason Moran, who you see at the piano there, has always been inspired by Saul. So it's this way of having a kind of collection that people can engage with over time. And we're actually bringing Jason in after this performance to do a solo show at the museum coming up this fall. Another instance of this was with the Hall Art Foundation, which is a private collection based across Germany, England, and Vermont. And they had a little bit of an issue with an Anselm Kiefer. So this piece that you see at the center of this slide is called Narrow Are the Vessels. And it's a concrete sculpture that was sitting in Andy and Christine Hall's backyard in Connecticut. And some of their neighbors, though they couldn't see it and they knew it was there, and they didn't like it. And so they went to the town, and it got deemed to be a structure, and they didn't have the permits for that. So again, they came to us and they said, well, MASS MoCA has a lot of space. Maybe they'll help us out here. And so we said, well, you know, one sculpture doesn't make a show. What else do you have? And it turns out that they have a lot, including like a dozen Anselm Kiefer paintings. And so this was an installation of this inside the museum, which was a 2-year exhibition. And it was done for 2 years because they knew they couldn't take this sculpture back. And so we wanted to work with them to find a place to site it long-term. And this is a little different than the LeWitt, in where we really collaborated with another museum and the artist's estate. Because this is a private collection, it's branded slightly separately. So it's the Hall Art Foundation at MASS MoCA. They have their own curator, and they lease this space from us. So it's also a revenue driver. And they renovated, which was this old water tank. And this started off as a 15-year loan. And I think even though we hadn't reached the 15-year mark, we just renewed it for another 5 years. And so the original sculpture is in there, along with a whole series of paintings. And then a few years after it opened, they put this Franz West, Pomme d'Adam, out front. And this is its own building. It's not connected to our other buildings. It actually sits right next to that power plant and where the Airstream trailer is. And then in 2017, we did our biggest renovation yet, which would double the size of the museum, and that was with Building 6, which is primarily dedicated to long-term exhibitions. But this time we worked with a lot of artists directly rather than just collections and estates. One of the first was James Turrell. So we have 10 James Turrells on site. One sort of version of every kind of work that he's made. And some of these, which are sort of built into the space, like the one on the, I can't even remember my left and right here, the one on that side, when looking at the screen and knowing it's different, which is one of his Gansfelds, was built directly into the space. And then in the summer of 2021, we finally built his sky space, which he had conceived of before the museum even opened in an old water tank on our campus. And these are there for however long James Turrell decides they should be there. And then the last one I'll briefly talk about is Laurie Anderson. So as we were figuring out Building 6, which also includes long-term exhibitions with Louise Bourgeois and Jenny Holzer and Gunnar Schoenbeck, we knew we wanted to work with artists who might change things and not just have something stay stable. So how could we support that artist in the same way that we do when we commission artworks? And Laurie became the prime example of that. We had a long, long relationship with her. These are 2 instances of her doing performances at MASS MoCA, where she's done a ton of residencies towards every major performance. And I remember shortly after I started at MASS MoCA, I was asked, what do you think a museum of Laurie Anderson's voice would look like? And I was like, I don't know, but I want to work on that. So I became what Laurie calls her forever curator. This is a 15-year engagement with her in a series of galleries that she changes over with some frequency. When we first started, she was like, every month, and I was like, absolutely not. I was like, we've got 300,000 square feet, we can't do this. So at the beginning we were doing every year, now we're sort of every other year, but this is just a selection of things, and it ranges from new work. We really want this to be an incubator for her, and historic work. So like the two images in the middle are both older pieces, one of which, the table, we've refabricated for her. It hadn't existed since the 60s. And so it's just been an amazing opportunity to watch a living artist think about their own archive and their own new work. And Jenny Holzer sort of functions the same way, and so it becomes a living collection in that way. I think that was my last slide. Thank you.
Great. I love MASS MoCA, and that presentation just made me want to go back. That's so exciting. Thank you.
Well, come on back. We're about to build a roller coaster, so, opens at the end of October.
Say no more. That sounds fantastic. Great. Mark, you've got a heck of a pair of presentations to follow here, but I'd like to kick it over to Mark Mitchell, who is the Holcomb T. Green Curator of American Paintings and Sculpture at the Yale Art Gallery. And also, Mark, I'd just like to say welcome back. I know you are an alum of our fine university, so I'm glad you're here. Welcome.
Thank you, Sam. And thank you all for coming. I'm just so happy to be back. I feel like this is my intellectual home, and so it is a joy to be with you and to have the chance to celebrate the museum's 60th anniversary. This is a very special moment for everyone involved with this university, and so I just share my joy with you, Loretta and Amanda and all the staff members who are here, because I know how hard you work to keep this going, and I commend you because you've done a great thing, and this exhibition is beautiful, so thank you.
Yeah, well said.
So I work at the Yale University Art Gallery, and as I did an informal poll last night, I realized the odds of most of you having ever been there are rather slim, and so I will just acknowledge that the Yale University Art Gallery is about 91 minutes down Route 91, straight south of here, easy on, easy off. And so I strongly encourage you to come and visit the art gallery, renovated in true MASS MoCA fashion in 2012, and concatenated 3 historic buildings into one unit. And you see those 3 buildings here. From the right, the 1866 Gothic Revival Street Hall building, which was the museum's second home. And then to the left of it, you see the old Yale Art Gallery building by Edgerton Swartout from 1928. And last, at the far left in the distance, which is a little hard to see, is the Louis Kahn building from 1953, of one of the sort of masterpieces of modernist architecture in America. And so we have this huge ambling structure combined for the first time, and coming out of COVID is a wonderful time to come back and visit us if you haven't in a long time and have never seen these 3 buildings integrated. It is a very special place. It is the oldest university gallery in America, and it was founded in 1832, and so a little bit younger than the National Academy, but it is certainly a place that has a lot of shared history with old organizations like that one. And so it is a benefit and it is a liability, as I think is a constant refrain in any old organization in this country. The first building that I mentioned, Street Hall, you see here, and this is where our historical American collections are displayed. I'm responsible for the historical American paintings and sculpture, so that's up to about 1950. And this building, when it opened just after the Civil War, was designed to not only be the new art gallery, but also to be the first school of art. And this was the first school of art at a university in America. And it was Yale's first coeducational program. So it was the first school that women could enroll in at Yale. It would be 100 years before women could enroll in another program at Yale College in 1969. And so the Yale School of Art was a very important transformative pivot for the university. And it was a place that was created and commissioned to have its front door, you see the front door there in the foreground, facing Chapel Street, which is the main thoroughfare running along the campus. So it was intended to face outward from Yale to the public. It was intended to connect the university and the community. By its founding charter, the Yale School of Arts classes would be open to the public and not just to students at the university. And the School of Arts still offers public classes as well as the classes for enrolled students at the university. So it really changed what Yale College was all about. And this is a long time ago. And it is part of what I would call a constant changing mission, constantly changing mission that has been a part of the journey of this institution and all the curators who have come through it, like me. I've been there for 7 years, and it has really, in that time, changed for me and by me. And so I'm very grateful to be at such an amazing place with such an incredibly rich history, but also a promising future. I think as a collecting institution, there is a real responsibility, and we've heard so much today about that incumbent responsibility for our institutions, and it is tremendous, and it is weighty. We feel it every day. And so there is a sense of responsibility and an ethic that you will hear about in my remarks today. I want to feature not just the sort of public-facing side. I'm going to give you a sense of that now. This is what our galleries look like. I want you to see inside the museum and not just the outside of our structures, because there is a sense of richness and range of kinds of experience in our buildings. There is a huge variety of cultures and histories represented. You see Asian art, you see American paintings and sculpture, you see ancient sculpture, you see modern and contemporary art, and then you see our sculpture garden there at the left. So there are many different kinds of experiences people can have at the art gallery. And what I want to do today is to feature 3 case studies. I'm going to follow Nico's model. And show you a few things that we've acquired recently and give you a sense of how our math is changing and how our strategies are changing to try to continue to embrace our responsibility as a public institution, a public-facing institution, and to be part of our best selves, basically, to reach out and to really serve the public at large and not just be a sort of historically facing organization. So this is a miniature painting, a miniature of a woman named Rose Prentice, who was born into slavery. And we talked earlier today about the challenges of incorporating early histories of enslavement in the Northeast earlier today. And Rose Prentice was born into slavery in Cambridge, Massachusetts, at the end of the 18th century. You see her by 1809, she had gained her freedom. And she served as a nursemaid for a family in New Hampshire and then another in Boston. And you see her here in a portrait that was created by one of the leading portrait painters of Boston at the time, Sarah Goodridge. And this is a painting that is about 4 inches tall. So I just want you to bear that in mind, because as we talk about collections and we talk about how we record works of art and how we talk about them, seeing them on a screen like this is incredibly disingenuous, because there is an intimacy and a closeness to objects like this. They were meant to be held in the hand and carried by the heart. These are incredibly closely held things, and it's important to understand that context as we think about a work like this one and how to make it come to life for our audiences and for our community. This is I don't even know how to describe, because most historical collecting institutions like ours, there's nothing like this. This is, when we talk about historical collections, we struggle to find any material to collect that can help tell these stories. So to have an object like this one surface that was unknown before adds dramatically to our opportunities to address this history and this woman's life history, and also the meaning of a work of art like this that was commissioned for a white family to record a beloved servant, someone who they employed, and descended in that white family. So it is not her agency that created this object. And we need to sort of bring all that forward as we talk about this work of art. This is a new acquisition, so we are still thinking about this right now. And one of the reasons that today's panels are so brilliantly organized, and I give you such credit, is that artists are so helpful to us in trying to make sense of historical narratives like this one. And we're fortunate to have Mickaleen Thomas working with our Curator of Modern Contemporary Art, Keely Orgeman, on how to present this miniature painting in a way that will help to, there was a word that we used earlier about, a sort of imaginative engagement, to move into an object like this and help open up its world and its meaning, and in this case especially the woman who is depicted in her world when her voice is not heard. And this is a situation where Thomas is someone whose art is about women's relationships with each other, especially mothers and daughters, but also matrilineal relationships. And so this is an opportunity for us to use that relationship and bring forward the richness of this history using a framework around a very small thing. Thomas creates whole installations, and she is going to, for the first time, really engage longer history. So she's extending her own practice at the same time as she's embracing a new work of art that has not been a part of the stories that we have about American art history. Works like these, and I said I wanted to show you behind the scenes, and so I'm going to give you a few glimpses like this one. Works like these are typically stored in places like this. Watercolor miniatures, like works on paper, are light sensitive. Photographs, all light sensitive. So best practices in museums today means you can show them for a maximum of 3 months every 3 years under very low light conditions. So they have to live in the dark. It's a tremendous burden on us as an institution when we want nothing more than to trumpet the presence of this wonderful work of art, something that really opens our eyes to history. We have to use it very strategically and carefully when we do bring it forward into the public eye. Many of our light-sensitive works have to live in places like this where they are not accessible. That said, as you'll see in a few minutes, we have taken big strides forward to make things more available. The second work I'd like to talk about briefly is a landscape painting by Ralph Albert Blakelock. This is a painting from about 1888. Blakelock is someone, a romantic, visionary landscape painter, somebody who is widely admired in the American canon, but someone who suffered from mental illness. And mental illness is a stigma in our culture and society that we often associate with artists, and that's a very strange dynamic. Genius and insanity are somehow, in our minds, linked, and we have to be very careful about that kind of assumption, and also about what it means about the experience of an artist like this one. Thanks to tools that Yale has to really study works of art like this at the Institute for the Preservation of Cultural Heritage, we're able to look beneath the surface of a painting like this one and learn much more fully about the artist's experience and practice. This is from the very pinnacle of his career. This was a gift to the gallery. And you see here x-rays of it that show nothing at first. On the left is the primary image, and the same image is duplicated at the right with a contour drawing over it that shows the features, very subtle features of a human figure. Well, that made us curious because we didn't know anything about a human figure beneath the landscape. And that led us, this is Anna Krez here on the left, one of our conservation scientists, to use existing losses to take cross-sections of the painting. And this is from the sky. You see it under specular light and under ultraviolet light on the right. And you can see two campaigns on this painting, a green and blue layer on the top, a series of striations, followed by a huge thick layer of lead white, followed by a brown and sort of tan layer in the bottom. There are about 4 dozen layers of paint on this surface. 48 layers, meticulously applied. This is not the sort of madness, darkness, sort of immediate gesture of somebody who is out of their mind and incapable of systematic thought. On the contrary, this is somebody who is extremely careful and really builds their surfaces thoughtfully, which led us to apply a new technology of X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy. Looking at the back of the painting, you see a grid here overlaid. That's the crossbars of the back of the painting. You have to get behind that lead white layer to see what's going on beneath the surface of this painting. And what I think you can see here, and I'm going to give you the sort of, if I can get the little laser to work, you can see a woman's head at the top, her body, and the same contour from the X-ray of the book that she's holding, as well as 2 putti there over her shoulders, 2 angels. And so suddenly we have a sort of a Madonna figure beneath a landscape, and her body perfectly correlates to the moonlit sky of the eventual landscape. So far from a sort of immediate gestural sort of representation of a madman, we have something that is incredibly richly developed and shows us a sort of whole pattern of thought behind a composition that has such depth and strata behind its accumulation. This is what painting storage looks like in our museum. You see hundreds of paintings on hundreds of racks. Our museum has the same number of objects as MASS MoCA has square feet. We have 300,000 objects in the collection of the Yale University Art Gallery. And so painting storage is one way that we economically store two-dimensional objects and make them available. You see Kelsey Wingle, one of our conservators here, conducting a survey. My last instance takes me in a new direction, and this is contemporary art. This is a Koshare figure by a Jemez Pueblo artist, potter named Kathleen Wall. And this is part of a recent gift that we received from a collector and alumna who really has spent her whole life very engaged with Pueblo potters. And the artist of this work is very happy that this Native American object has come to the Yale Art Gallery and has become part of an expansion of our collecting practice. We have not historically collected Native American art. And so this is the sort of starting point. We were able to conduct interviews with Kathleen Wall and bring her voice into the gallery when we first showed this work of art. Here she's talking about a group of Koshare figures. These are these clown figures. This is part of the Native American, Pueblo origin story of clowns emerging from the clay of the earth as the first people. And clay, mother clay, as the sort of divinity is understood in Pueblo tradition, becomes animate in these figures. And she's talking about her aunts and her mothers and her grandmothers' work in these ceramic figurines. Here you see the Koshare figure at the center of our gallery in American Paintings and Sculpture, drawing people in with its lively and vital story. She is an incredibly vigorous and animated figure, one that sort of calls out and speaks to very different attitudes towards art and towards collections than most Western curators and museums think of. And it has been a revelation to me, and I think to many, to encounter these objects in our galleries and to think about collections as living things, living beings endowed with life force that we we're not just responsible for, and we definitely don't own in any conventional sense, but we care for, and we have responsibility to. And so I think if I had one thing I'd like to emphasize today, it's that attitudes towards collections as we learn more and expand our conversations about what collecting can be, they change. And stewardship, the responsibility to care for works of art and to recognize in them the living voice of their creators, is much more relevant and, I think, meaningful to me as a curator than any model I have encountered heretofore. Yale has, in 2018, opened an open study storage center, as we were talking about earlier. This is some of the glass storage cases in which a huge percentage of the collection is now accessible. Yale keeps all of its works on paper, accessible all the time in our study rooms. So we have study rooms for prints and drawings, study room for photographs, numismatics, as well as object study classrooms where works of art can be brought out for classes, meetings, and scholarly visits. This space is much more of an open register. It offers thousands and thousands of objects. It's about the size of a football field. And it offers hundreds of cases where you can see collections from all across the world and throughout time. And it creates a kind of constant access, which is much more meaningful and productive for us as an institution, because the objects are always available, and they don't have to be sort of manipulated to be well seen. And so this is, I think, what Loretta and everybody else sort of looks forward to as a way to sustain access and be sure that all of these collections, especially as we make what I would call sort of incremental progress towards better representation, especially in the American tradition, towards making these works of art present in our lives and present for our students and audiences. This can be a publicly accessible space. And so it's really a great addition to our range of spaces in which we show our art. Ultimately, our goal, like everyone's goal, is to make these objects sing. You see Xiao Situ, one of our gallery educators here, speaking to our public and sharing her delight in ancient textiles. And that is really the kind of sense of joy and love. I think we used the word hug earlier today. You know, there is a sense of that embrace that great works of art and sort of truthful and honest relationships to each other and to our collections can help us to extend to our publics. So it is a big mandate, and it's a very challenging time that we inhabit, but it is certainly a tremendous opportunity as well. So thank you.
Great, thank you. So now what I would like to do is ask a few questions to our panelists and open up the conversation. I don't want the panelists to feel like they have to address every question, but if you feel compelled, please, by all means. And I hope audience members will also continue to think about questions that they may have. Otherwise I'll do what I do with my seminars, and we'll just stare at each other until one of you feels peer pressured into asking a question. And I also too, I gave the panelists some heads up of what types of questions that I wanted to ask, and so I feel a little badly asking something completely different, but I do want to ask something that related to comments that artist Jefferson Pinder commented on this morning, and this continuity and change dynamic. But in particular, each one of you talked about some creative solution or new direction that was different from how I understand some traditional museum practice. And each of you gestured at some of the resistance to making those changes. So how do we work through some of the fear or the hesitation, the conservatism, rules, maybe even laws that sort of resist these changes. And I'm thinking about your comments relating to activating historical collections that are endowed with life force, or displaying replicas outdoors, and new work with artists to interpret historical collections. So can any of you speak to how you sort of work through some of those hesitations and sort of go beyond?
I mean, I like what Mark said, which was this reminder that we don't own these things. We steward them, we care for them. And I think what we're seeing now is a museum world that is reckoning with that notion of ownership, of holding on, and moving more towards a culture of care and stewardship. And I think that's why these conversations are so important to have right now, because we're in this really pivotal time. You know, it's just not the way it used to be. And I think that, you know, I'm really glad you asked that question, because, you know, it came up for all of us that there are these different models. And models that also inherently support our audience and our artists, which is really important.
Totally. Okay, so like all day I've been waiting to share this anecdote just because I'm a dork. But so I have some friends that are curators at what I call the Blacksonian, but I'm learning to say like the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Those two things are the same for me. And yeah, they were talking about how like right around the time that they were opening, every time that they would go to get in their car to go home, that there would just be like mountains and mountains of things, like basically by, you know, the loading dock, where people were so excited at the prospect of having a Black museum on the National Mall that they were like digging stuff up from their attics and their basements and just donating it to the museum, right? And I think this is like a really abstract answer to your question, so I apologize. But yeah, it's like, what if there was space for that in our ecosystem, right? Like actually holding those objects with the same care that the communities, that the institutions are for, hold those objects with. And then how do you have that discussion, right? Like I think so often we're so concerned with, you know, a national conversation or artists that are known, you know, through these various vetting systems, but what it means to acknowledge, you know, those artists alongside local artists that are often excluded from the museums in their community. And so how you kind of bridge that gap, both representationally, but in terms of, you know, education and practice, I think becomes like just an awesome space of experimentation. And if anything, I think what COVID has kind of like forced the hand of is institutions experimenting. And, you know, I think that ultimately is a good thing. I think it can be a little bit messy, but, you know, I think the mess is a good mess. So.
I completely agree with what you said, Nico, and I just want to sort of add an endorsement to your book, because your book is just terrific and a great resource. I've had a chance to read it now, and it is really special. And I feel like you address a lot of these topics and obviously your people you were interviewing address a lot of these topics very thoroughly. And I think for me, you know, my takeaway in the present day is really that as institutions, we have to more and more embrace a certain amount of chaos. And we can't try to control or constrict or be gatekeepers. Like, that's not the job. The job is to connect our humanity to each other, to, you know, find works of art that help people to make meaning for themselves and between themselves. And I feel like there is no doubt in my mind that we have to be comfortable making mistakes in that process. And that's tough, because we spend money doing these things. We spend time. We only have so many hours in our days. We only have so many years in our lives. But we have to keep trying and making mistakes. And we have to, I mean, working in a university museum, like the University Museum of Contemporary Art here, we have to embrace each other in that journey, and that extends to our students. So, you know, they become, I was talking with Jefferson about this at lunch, you know, we have to welcome more people in. And our students are incredible resources for that, because they don't have any sense of what's, you know, untouchable, what's, you know, oh, we don't do that, you know, and there's no sense of tradition or, well, you know, rigidity or what have you. there is a much greater readiness to say, what about this? And what about this is a great place to begin. And I feel like if we talked more about connecting and finding our shared humanity, I think we would do much better as institutions serving our mission, A, and finding and redirecting what I consider a really misguided public discourse around museums. Like, I think it's almost sort of way off the tracks at this point. Most of the things that are talked about in public, discourse are inaccurate to my experience at this stage. And so I welcome the opportunity to say, no, we're working together. And we see shared humanity rather than, all of the endless schisms in our culture, of every variety. And instead, to fully see each other, that should be our goal. And I'm so grateful for the academic developments of recent years, especially at Yale, around transnational identity and cultural movement of people and ideas, because it moves us into a space of really seeing each other. And that's, I think, where we should be trying to get.
Thanks for bringing up the student component of this. We're thrilled to have a number of students here with us today, and that sort of maybe we could have them in mind when sort of addressing this question. I'm curious, historians are notoriously bad at predicting the future. That's not really our job, right? But I would love to learn from you what each of you think these questions may look like around the corner. What does this sort of look like in the future? How might contemporary artists, communities, and students engage with arts, art and institutional collections of art moving forward? We got a really nice sense of what some of the present day issues are and a little bit of the sort of historical origins of those problems and ideas for moving forward. But I wonder if you could give us a sense of the future, either areas where you're optimistic or even a little more pessimistic about the state of things and where they'll go in the future.
The future is so scary. I'm like, literally don't know where to start. Yeah, so like the whole reason I'm an educator is because I love young people and I love people asking questions. And so I feel at home with students when they're like, but shouldn't we just burn down the institutions? And I'm like, okay, well, let's like talk that through, And I think part of that impulse comes from some collective sense that institutions are not necessarily designed to sustain into the future. Like they're not responsive enough to do so. Which, I go back and forth about whether I believe that or not. But, when I look into the future, what I see is in the way that you can look at kind of melanin forward at this moment and like the increased funding of artist-initiated projects and institutions, right? Like I think, to your point, I think culture at large is acknowledging the broader role of artists in society, right? Not just as like producers of objects, but as like radical imaginaries and creative problem solvers and like innovators on every level. And so, yeah, when I look at the future, I see artists at the center of more of culture's activities and more of culture's institutions. And, that's like what I hope to just sprinkle whatever energy I have on like making that a reality. And, I think what I also hear oftentimes is like, this all comes from like the scarcity mindset, right? Which is like, there's only so much space. So if we want new ways of working, new institutions, we have to get rid of the old. And I don't actually agree. I think that there's so much work that needs to happen. And I think that there's the work that happens inside institutions, which is the amazing, beautiful work that I see both of you doing that is so essential because, that sits alongside all of these kind of alternative ways of working that don't necessarily rely on resources, kind of being specific to a certain place. And so, yeah, I get excited by like the mess that I see when I see the future. And I get excited about it because it feels like raw material that artists can really guide us in understanding in a way that shapes something like entirely new that hasn't even been written about, right? So I think, I don't know who I told this to earlier, but I was like really proud that, you know, I've never studied art history, but I've like made it this far as a curator, you know? Yeah, and so I think it's like, how do we reshape these conversations to rely less on what we've inherited and what we've been told, and more on like our instincts and like our understanding of what the needs are today and now in relation to the questions that we're asking. So yeah, I don't know what I see in the future is my short answer.
Really thoughtful response, though.
Okay,
I appreciate that, yeah.
I mean, I love that the future is messy, and I think it should be, because if it's not messy, then we're not working all the shit out.
Right.
And, you know, I think of how we used to be taught that there's a kind of like pyramid of power with like institutions and philanthropy sitting at the top and the artists serving that, and we're breaking that down. And I used to think we were inverting it, but I don't even think it's that. I think it can't be that same shape anymore. And I think whatever that shape ends up being, like that's what the future is. And I think it's seen through the eyes of an aliveness. You know, you talking about collecting this miniature portrait and then bringing an artist like Michelin in to say, well, what does this mean to your practice, to our students? Or, you know, the fact that we're working with living artists all the time, and the agency that they have to not just be in the present, but to be looking back and forward. And I think that's what the most exciting thing is like not knowing where that mess is going to get us. It might just get us to another mess, and that's great too.
And I think that, you know, the thing that has to be stressed over and over again, especially, you know, in the case, I gave an example of a Native American object and a whole collection coming into the museum, but, you know, I should not have, and I don't want to permit to persist the impression that I did that. I did not do that. I worked with a lot of people who did that. And many of those people are Native American people. And they are, some of our students, Anthony Trujillo, was a crucial partner. He did the interviews. He is a Pueblo person, and he went and interviewed those artists in person and offered those incredible testimonies that we could then incorporate into the gallery. So, you know, as we look at collections and think about like what's next in the future, we have to give up the idea that any of us is the person. We're not. We can facilitate. I think about listening to Jefferson talk about, you know, taking 3 weeks to get his badge. You know, I view my role as like helping Jefferson get his badge. Like there is no level to which I will, you know, not stoop to enable Jefferson to get his badge. And, you know, we've just hired our first curator of Native American art at Yale, Royce Youngwolf. And, you know, my job is to ensure her success. Like, that's my job. I am not doing her work, I am lifting her up. And I think that that is a really crucial change of perception for a lot of people about what a curator does. A curator for me is somebody who facilitates and makes possible and helps ease others' success, and, you know, doesn't seek any kind of personal prominence or something. Control is really the wrong word if you're thinking about a curatorial career. You know, it is really facilitation, connection, human understanding, and being able to form connections, relationships. It's 100% about relationships. If you want to know what the success of being a curator is, it's relationships. Yeah. And that is, I can't say it enough. And I feel very fortunate to be at an institution that is shifting. Will it shift fast enough? Doubtful, but it will shift. Yeah. And it is a very strong institution and vibrant. And so it has a lot to offer in a lot of different directions. It doesn't just do one kind of work. And I feel like to recognize that collections are not constrained by one dynamic. They have many dynamics. As many dynamics as they have artists represented, and objects and loans and exhibitions, and it is a beautiful mess. And so, you know, to be a part of that very human project, I'm totally signed up, and you can count on me for optimism because, you know, look around. I don't know, the number of, you know, museum studies programs in this country, they're multiplying like mushrooms. And, you know, there is such interest in museums among students. Museum studies classes sell out. There is belief or hope for what these institutions can be. And to me, an institution is just a collection of people.
Yeah.
And, you know, that, I don't see, you know, I don't have a lot of the negative associations that I think have become ingrained in us by sheer repetition in the media. And so for me, the opportunities are kind of unlimited, and I feel like it's a very inspiring time. It's an old saying, may you live in interesting times. Well, welcome to them.
I love too that you brought up the word curator, because I'm always of two minds of it. I'm like, I don't know, I think I'm a producer more than I'm a curator. But then when I think of the root of curator in the word care, it's again this expansion of what that care is. It used to be the care for artifacts and objects, but now as I'm saying, it's the care for a much bigger system of people and culture and ideas. And you know, I think that is like ultimately that mess that we're talking about, which is beautiful.
Wow, thank you. I know that was not an easy question, but I appreciate the opportunity to ask it. I wonder if there are questions from the audience.
Here comes Karen.
Karen, yes, please.
That led me to my question. Thank you all for these amazing presentations. I'm curious to hear, this is a version of a question I asked the artists, what challenges you've faced in trying to extend this care, because it's so utopian what you're saying, but I also hear Nico saying the future is also very scary, and some of you are in institutions where the power structure of the institution might push you in certain directions that might not allow that care. I'm looking at Mark. How do you negotiate tensions when you're getting pushed back against the things you're trying to do to make the institution a more open place? Have you negotiated these situations?
I think it's also important to talk about the negotiation of a career spent caring for others and where you actually find that. I think one of the big things about care and the peril of it is burnout. You know, I'm lucky to work at an institution that doesn't push back on anything I do, so I can't speak to that part, but I know that it can sometimes be an exhausting thing to feel the burden of that, but not want to lift that burden. And especially working with living artists, that's a huge part of it, you know.
Yeah. So I'm gonna go back in time to like 2014, when I got appointed as this kind of like, you know, founding position at the Studio Museum to build the public programs and community engagement department. And because there was no precedent, right, for kind of building out a program methodology that wasn't just like the curator saying, you know, here's an artist, we want to do a project with them, produce it, right? It was actually like, how do we build out an offering that the public understands, that the public chooses to engage, you know, over time. And so, like, one of the first things I did when I got there was I went and I asked every museum department, you know, what does community engagement mean to you and how does it like show up in your work? And like 90% of the departments were like, it doesn't, like that's not our mandate, like we don't have to worry about that. And this was on the precipice of like the museum closing and existing only in community, right? Like there's literally gonna be no space that someone could come to see art or to engage the mission of the museum. It was gonna be public parks, public libraries. And so I was like, yeah, we have to like mobilize some buy-in internally. Like we have to be speaking the same language internally before we can step beyond the walls of the museum and ask other people to join us, you know, in like asking these questions. And so I think when I compare that to the experience of colleagues, you know, friends of mine in other museums, it's like, how do you ensure that you're all kind of working through the same value system and working in the same direction? You know, because even underneath the umbrella of a mission, there can be different interpretations of like how that mission shows up, why it shows up. And so I would say that was probably the biggest challenge, right? Was spending the first 3 years trying to get people excited about the idea that like the work they were doing needed to be relevant to the people that currently didn't actually even see the museum as a resource. Like that was where we needed to start. And so, I think doing that through various kind of like interdepartmental, activities, which I think can be, we all know how those can go sometimes, but really trusting in the process, right? And trusting that like, if we're gonna do this thing and do it well, which like we're gonna do, we actually need to all be in like good community with each other and, collaborating in a way that's authentic. And then I would say that as an independent now, the challenge is that like every institution operates differently, and so you'll spend a lot of time, working deeply with the staff of one place. You'll come to some sense of understanding around best practices and maybe like where the broader culture is headed, and then you take 10 steps to the right and enter another institution, and it can be a whole other set of concerns, challenges, issues. And so it's like how you kind of build a continuity, between these experiences, taking what you've learned and still trying to advance change, in institutions that, for the most part, are kind of operating at a pace that's much different than the pace of being independent. So, yeah, I think those are my challenges.
But boy, are we lucky, because we have organizations like the Studio Museum that have been out there doing this work for a long time. And, Thelma Golden is one of the leading lights of the entire museum field.
Totally.
And Sandra Jackson-Dumont, who you interviewed in your book, who gives a great synopsis a lot of what you're saying, and then extends it even farther in terms of buy-in from around the museum. And, we talk a lot, when we talk about museums, we talk about certain museums. And, that always makes me a little grumpy because, I don't like hearing about MoMA and the Met, and because in a lot of ways, those are not museums. And I realize that might sound a little strange because they're paradigmatic museums. But they're not typical in any way. And in a lot of ways, they resemble museum work not at all. The journeys of their curators, the journeys of their staffs, the journeys of their leadership, their boards, they do not resemble museums that I've ever worked at.
Yeah.
And what I think is crucial is to find the models that you need and to keep looking if they're not right in front of you, and to not obsess about organizations that are of a different, they're just of a completely different genus than the museums that, the University Museum, all the museums that we've worked at. And places like the Studio Museum they're disproportionately inspiring. And maybe that's a little utopian, because the Studio Museum has its challenges, absolutely. And I marvel at how resilient it has proven. But I feel like we as a field, and like all of our conversations around what a museum is, we need to kind of move away from the kind of big museum benchmark, because that's not, for most of us, it's not our experience. And as you're saying, like every museum is totally different from every other museum, but none of them are like those. And, I feel it gets back to the mess thing. Every museum is different and challenging. And I feel like personally, I was built for this. I was built to work in the mess and to find connections to other people and to look for where we can work together. We got 2 cents. Okay, maybe we'll put them in the corner and turn it into an exhibit. But, I feel like there is tremendous opportunity if you seek it and if you understand what's possible and find what's possible and persist. And don't just kind of utopianism is a kind of it can almost be derogatory because it sounds like I'm not practical. I'm extremely practical. No, I know. But I'm just saying, like, to other people, they may have heard that in your question. And I feel like pragmatism and resiliency are by far the better metrics. I am determined to find commonalities, determined to keep moving and keep working, and to do better. And, every conversation I've ever had about the future of museums is like, the future we all aspire to is not tomorrow. it's like way down the pike. But we have to keep putting one foot in front of another. We have to do the small things every single day. I think you call it a habit. We have to have the habits, good habits, of constantly interrogating ourselves, questioning our motives, questioning our collaborators, and moving forward so that we don't ever just sit still. It's never going to be perfect, but we're going to keep putting one foot in front. It might be pretty close to the last foot, but that's the point, is to keep moving forward. And I think about really small stuff we've done, and this might be a little embarrassing to even say out loud, but women sitters in our historic portraits collection have historically been known by their husband's names. So Mrs. William Smith is the sitter in a Copley portrait. Well, we did away with that. All women in our collections are now known by their own proper names, and their own proper names at about the time of the painting. Like, you'll have a 6-year-old child under the title Mrs. William Smith when she didn't get married for another 10 years. That's horrifying. And so we undid all of that. And, it's a small thing. But we shouldn't be telling our children and our girls that, they will someday be known by their husband's name. That's so beyond where we are at this point that it's a little shocking that it's still present. But we have to be looking for those things, changing them, and keep moving forward. And for me, that's the resolution.
I always say working in a museum is like being the most stable adrenaline junkie you can be. We have to be able to make it all work, but then leap into the unknown.
Yeah.
It's a lot of leaping.
A lot of leaping.
I want to express my sincere gratitude. We are at 3 o'clock, and I know people are preparing for the campus collections tours, which is this really incredible opportunity for us to experience some of these remarkable treasures and learn more about this campus. I want to express my gratitude for being able to participate in today's events. I learned a tremendous amount from both of these sessions, and encourage folks to check out the exhibition, and encourage folks to keep up with your work and things that are coming up for you. I'm sure you'll be hanging out for a little bit, so if people maybe have questions, you might be willing to continue the conversation there. But I hope folks in the audience will join me in thanking you.